Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan of the New York Times have new reporting on the debates inside the White House last year over suspending habeas corpus for undocumented immigrants. The reporting comes from their new book, Regime Change, which will be released next Tuesday. They detail a memo dated April the 29th of 2025 from Will Scharf, an arch-conservative lawyer serving as the White House staff secretary, with the subject line of the writ of habeas corpus. The Constitution, Mr. Scharf wrote in his memo to Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, permits suspension of habeas corpus only in cases of rebellion or invasion. Courts have almost uniformly held that only Congress can do it. Mr. Scharf did not say what Mr. Trump should do, but the implication was plain. Suspension of habeas rights without congressional authorization would almost certainly be found unlawful, and the court fight would become a huge self-inflicted distraction. Suspending habeas corpus was one of two radical ideas that Stephen Miller, yes, that Mr. Miller, had been pushing that alarmed Mr. Scharf. The other was invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy the military to enforce the law on American streets as protests grew against deportation sweeps. That discussion came to a head in late January after federal agents had shot and killed two U.S. citizens who had been voicing their opposition to the administration's deportation policies in Minnesota. Haberman and Swan report that days after the killing of Alex Pretty, Susie Wiles had a meeting in her West Wing office where Vice President J.D. Vance said the administration needed to invoke the Insurrection Act swiftly to crush the unrest in Minnesota. The meeting broke up without a decision, a vague consensus to keep thinking about it, but had been clarifying in its own way. Even after the administration's posture had helped escalate tensions in Minnesota, even with the blowback mounting, the vice president and Mr. Miller were still searching for a reason to put federal troops on American streets. Joe, we know that Stephen Miller has wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. We know from General Milley that President Trump wanted to do it in the first administration as well. What's been amazing about Jonathan and Maggie's reporting is to get right in the room where these discussions were taking place.
They were, as the song goes, they were in the room where it happened. And what is so shocking is what actually was said inside those rooms time and time again. And Jonathan Lemire, you actually have the Vice President of the United States talking about invoking the Insurrection Act. Talk about an unconstitutional use of power. Invoking the Insurrection Act to crush American citizens protesting in American streets. And as Maggie and Jonathan wrote, this was after they had already gunned down two innocent Americans for doing just that, for protesting. And yet they're still talking about enacting the Insurrection Act. They're still talking about suspending habeas corpus through this entire period. You know, maybe it's just the lawyer in me, but excerpts from this book are reading, whether you look at Todd Blanche trying to cover up one of the biggest pedophile rings in the history of America, or you have the vice president and Stephen Miller talking about suspending habeas corpus and the Insurrection Act. That sure does look like a place where a lot of lawyers in the future are going to start discovery in their investigations, whether it is with a Democratic Congress, whether it is with prosecutors, because the president may try to pardon a lot of people. It's not going to be able to pardon the entire government. And these just seem to be clearly illegal acts or a conspiracy to commit illegal acts. No wonder, and I know you've heard this like I've heard this, no wonder the White House is melting down over this book, because there's so many people who are exposed who are going to have to hold up the right hand at some point and take an oath and tell everybody what happened behind those closed doors, because even the glimpse we're getting from this book is ugly.
Yeah, ugly, as you say, illegal and deeply un-American. I mean, this is extraordinary. Both of these revelations in this new piece. I mean, as the Times writes about the Insurrection Act debate, that Vance says it needs to invoke the Insurrection Act to crush the unrest in Minnesota, and this is because he says that this because outside agitators and the like are fueling this. Even though at that moment, of course, the White House was already realizing that neither Alex Preddy nor Miss Good, neither of them were paid. These were not, Antifa or whatever nonsense they wanted to put out there. These were just average Americans who were trying to protest what they saw was un-American behavior by these ICE agents on the streets of Minneapolis. You're right to say that the White House is freaking out about this book. There was even an Axios report over the weekend that there's fears that perhaps the Times reporters have recordings from inside the Situation Room, which would be an extraordinary step, and they're worried about that. And let's also remember here, these are floated. They were not enacted. Doesn't mean they won't be down the road. And I think that's some discussion even this morning we're having here is like, if the Insurrection Act was floated then, who's to say it can't come back at some point, perhaps in front of the midterm elections? So we're still sifting through this new reporting from Maggie and Jonathan on the Times website, dropped this morning. That new book coming out this month. Undoubtedly, there will be more in it.
The boys are back with us. Miles, your reaction to everything we saw in D.C. this weekend, quite the juxtaposition.
It was, Stephanie, a weekend of humiliation for the president and for the United States of America. Of course, Donald Trump has lost a number of rulings in the courts about having his name on federal buildings and rewriting history in national parks. He was forced to take those things down this weekend, start reversing them. And at the same time, the country, I think, was humiliated by this spectacle. Now, let me just say, I'm not opposed to the idea of the United States having some sort of UFC fight or some sort of event. But I think to anyone watching this, anyone steeped in history, this felt a lot like America's Roman moment. And to those students of history, they'll probably remember a satirist from Roman times named Juvenal, who watched his country slide into autocracy and coined a very famous phrase, bread and circuses. That is what he said Roman rulers, as the Roman Republic fell and turned into the empire, gave their people to distract them from that slide into despotism. If you were going to create an image, Steph, of American decline, you could not have created an image that echoed better back to Roman times than this. The gladiator-like spectacle in front of the White House on the emperor's 80th birthday. I think it was alarming for a lot of reasons. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our leaders don't remember those echoes of history.
Well, that's one way to look at it. Damian, your colleagues at the Journal wrote that Trump bet on this UFC event to energize his base. And this morning, he's now previewing his next big rally is going to be at the Washington and Lincoln monuments. Is it realistic to think that these things are going to boost his standings? I mean, I get that Miles is saying for anyone who's sort of steeped in history, loads of folks aren't. Loads of people are thinking about the Roman Empire every 90 seconds, and they think it's badass.
I think this was actually pretty clever. I think we're not going to know really till November about how effective it was. But if you think about both things we've been talking about today, Iran and what happened with the UFC fight, Trump's got problems with his base, okay? And the Iran deal, hopefully for him, for his base, will bring gas prices down. He can't have a nightmarish scenario where you have $4 a gallon gas in November. That'd be a total mess for Republicans. And here he's, it was young men who got him elected in 2024, and he needs to bring them home. And what better way for him to do it than to have this huge spectacle at the White House with the UFC? There were thousands and thousands of people here. A lot of them had a great time. It was a big show, and that's kind of what he specializes in. So whether he really just kind of sold this to a small subsection of people or not, or whether it's something that's bigger, whether he's saying America's kind of open, this is the people's country, there's no hallowed ground here, I'll take you wherever you want to go. Whether that's going to be effective or not, we will see. But he did put on an unprecedented show on Sunday night. There were a lot of people there. A lot of people tuned in, and it was quite entertaining. Now, whether it probably turned a lot of people off. Maybe those are the people who thought that his stuff is kind of brash anyway. But I think it was quite a gamble, and he almost needed a gamble with the way his poll numbers are right now.
Sure, but a lot of those young men who may have thought it was gangster and cool, a lot of those young men don't currently have jobs. They're worried about their job prospects, can't afford to move out of their mom or dad's house. and lost a lot of money in crypto. But I just want to bring up this point, David, and maybe I'm naive, okay? But after the fighter won his bout, he praised Donald Trump. That's not a surprise. But in front of the whole entire world, he said that our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, is a man. I don't care who you vote for. No one pushed back on that. I quickly checked. I went to social. I looked at it. Nobody pushed back on that. What message does this send the rest of the world in terms of decency? Because without decency, we actually have nothing.
It sends the message that we don't have any decency and that this is all a distraction and a game. It was incredibly disappointing that was, what the president wanted for his birthday, I guess. But I'm going to be your fellow idealist here. I think young American men, I think all young Americans, I think all American voters are smart. So that was a great TV show on Sunday. And, somebody said terrible things about the former First Lady, and that's, terrible. But they care about what you just mentioned. They want jobs. They want rising wages. The healthcare system in this country doesn't work. As you said, they can't move out of their parents' houses. There's so many parts of this country that aren't working properly, just the basic infrastructure, some regulation of the digital age. None of that has been delivered by the Trump administration. You can argue it wasn't delivered by the Biden administration either. But I trust my fellow Americans and I trust American voters to look at the reality of their lives, particularly the economic reality of their lives, and make, whatever decision they think is right in November. But I just think they're not going to get distracted by one UFC fight.
Listen, for everybody who loved it, who thought it was great American entertainment, that does not change the fact that the economy is the number one thing people vote on. It matters. Gentlemen, David, Damian, Miles, thank you all for starting us off on this very special hour.
The governor of the country's largest state, a likely future presidential contender, and one of the most prominent critics of Donald Trump, who currently holds elected office, is out with a stunning piece of news this afternoon. California Governor Gavin Newsom saying that he and his family have become targets of the Trump Justice Department simply because he has dared to stand up to and criticize Donald Trump. Here is some of Governor Newsom's statement posted online this afternoon.
One by one, anyone who has challenged Donald Trump has ended up on his hit list. And today, I proudly join that list. After calling for my arrest last year, Donald Trump directed his Department of Justice to investigate me. And just in the last week, I've learned that his campaign has reached my own home. To get me, he's coming after my wife, Jen, a public servant, a woman who's dedicated her life to supporting women and girls. Someone who has done nothing wrong other than having the temerity to advocate for what she believes in. If they can't intimidate me, they'll go after the mother of our children. Donald Trump picked the wrong target. We have nothing to hide. His political operatives can take every record and read every page, but they'll be looking in the wrong place. Because if they really want to find corruption, look no further than 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Donald Trump is selling the presidency. He's running the largest cash heist in American political history, trading foreign tariff relief for approval of his golf courses, day trading behind the Resolute desk, reaping hundreds of millions of dollars in personal profit. And he's doing it openly. He's doing it on camera. He did it last night on the White House lawn. He's doing it through cryptocurrencies. He's doing it through the receipt of a $400 million private jet from a foreign government that he plans to keep when he leaves office. Through his son's ventures in countries where his own administration is simultaneously making policy. His personal fortune has skyrocketed by $4 billion since making his return to office. This is the behavior of a regime, not a republic. The White House has become a marketplace for sneakers and coins and watches, cologne, guitars, Bibles, and phones. Influence for sale, access for sale. And today, my family and I can personally confirm that justice is for sale.
Aides to Governor Newsom say that at least part of the investigation focuses on the governor's wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, and that people affiliated with nonprofit groups that she runs have already been questioned by federal agents. Two sources tell our colleague Carol Lenig that a federal prosecutor's office based in Sacramento is focused on the tax filings of Jennifer Siebel Newsom. It began in early 2025 and is just one of several investigations centered around the Newsom family. Aides to Governor Newsom also say that the investigation picked up steam around the time that Todd Blanche took the reins at DOJ. That would, of course, coincide with the time he began very publicly auditioning for the role of permanent attorney general in earnest. The breaking news that California Governor Gavin Newsom has been targeted by the Justice Department, as delivered by Governor Newsom himself, is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times Justice Department reporter Glenn Thrush joins us. Also joining us, NYU law professor and legal analyst Melissa Murray. She's the author of The U.S. Constitution, a comprehensive and annotated guide for the modern reader. Also joining us, former Department of Justice pardon attorney Liz Oyer is back with us. Glenn Thrush, take us through your reporting on this story.
So basically what we know is what the governor has told us. The investigation, as far as we can tell, the reporting that we have done so far, and this is very preliminary, we just learned about this today, mostly focuses on the governor's wife and the not-for-profit that she runs. She's a documentarian. She's written about gender discrimination. There have been, over the years, critics who have scrutinized and criticized some of the donations they have taken. So this is apparently a tax investigation run out of Sacramento. We don't have a general sense yet that this is run out of Main Justice, but as I'm sure your viewers know, a sensitive political investigation against one of the president's hand-picked targets would have to essentially, if not be signed off on by the Attorney General, certainly within his realm of knowledge. But the one thing I would caution against is really assuming that there's absolutely no basis for this investigation. Obviously, Newsom wanted to get out in front of this story. So I would just caution folks to just wait a couple of beats as the reporting evolves to see if there was anything justified at the bottom of this. But I will say in general, it is uncanny. It is a heck of a coincidence that the only investigations that we keep hearing about involve Democrats and President Trump's targets. There don't seem to be any allies of President Trump's on these list of investigative targets that we are writing and talking about every single day.
Yeah, I mean, tax crimes are serious, but so is physical assault against cops. So I take your point, Glenn Thrush, but I want to focus in on the part of the timeline that coincides with Pam Bondi being fired, Todd Blanche very clearly auditioning for the permanent job. Just put out there for me anything I may have missed. What we know is that Comey, after 2 failed attempts to indict him, is indicted over the seashell malarkey that even right-wing legal analyst Jonathan Turley calls Bill Barr's favorite smear BS. We know that the governor and his wife come under scrutiny. Who else that's a critic is targeted as part of Todd Blanche's audition tape?
Well, as I reported the day before Bondi was fired, Bondi and Blanche had gotten together and identified a list of investigations to be fast-tracked. Newsom's name wasn't on it. Cassidy Hutchinson, the former aide to Mark Meadows, who testified before the J6 committee, was kind of at the top of the list, as was John Brennan, the former CIA director, who is now the subject of a floundering investigation in South Florida based on comments and an annex that he wrote into a report on Russian interference in the 2016 election. So there was a concerted effort by Blanche and Bondi at a time when Bondi felt her job was endangered to accelerate these investigations, to put everything on the front burner. Act Blue, the Democratic fundraising arm, that does appear to have some significant legal liability, potentially, in terms of an investigation, was also part of that list.
Glenn, do you have any knowledge of any investigations that Todd Blanche has overseen or been a part of that do not include investigations in the category of Trump-directed retribution?
I mean, they're not publicized. You know, the department.
But do you know of any?
Yeah, I mean, like, are we talking about sort of fentanyl stuff and Raul Castro and, but no, I mean,
no, I'm not talking about Marco Rubio's honey-do list. My point being, there is nothing known, and again, I won't speak for you. If you know of any, let me know.
Well, look, Nicole, there's no doubt that as and we should say that I believe Blanche is meeting today with Chuck Grassley, the administration's ally who is running the Senate Judiciary Committee, about Blanche's impending confirmation hearings, which we are hearing are not necessarily going to go in his favor. There's a real potential that at least two Republicans on the committee, Tom Tillis and John Cornyn, are going to raise serious objections. So he's facing an uphill battle. So there is this general sense, and Blanche denied that he was auditioning. But again, I would direct viewers to go online and look at this interview that he did with Sean Hannity, in which he does something truly extraordinary. Blanche had this general lawyerly reserve. He was kind of playing both sides here. Pushing forth this image of being, and Liz Oyer wrote about this wonderfully in her Substack the other day, that he'd been putting forth this image of somebody who is reasonable, who was going to protect the core interests of the department, while at the same time seeking to protect Trump's image. The first part of that equation has been thrown out over the past 6 to 8 weeks. He is doing everything that Trump wants him to do. And I think the question now is, will the Senate pay attention to this, or will they, as they have done in other Trump nominations, eventually cave and appoint and confirm Todd Blanche as the permanent attorney general?
I mean, Liz Oyer, the question for people like Tillis and Cassidy and Cornyn is, what will you do when your wife is under criminal investigation by the Department of Justice? Because retribution in the second term is broadly, understood by Todd Blanche to include Republican critics as well. I mean, I think that Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene and John Bolton would certainly, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, I mean, the list goes on and on, that retribution is a brush that can be painted across anyone that doesn't go along with the charade of a second term as president that Donald Trump is carrying out and Todd Blanche is enabling.
Yeah, so Blanche and Trump both know from personal experience that being under investigation is very damaging. Just the investigation itself, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of pressure on an individual's family just to be in that situation of being under criminal investigation. So they know the power of opening an investigation into an enemy of the president. That is a punishment unto itself, even if it goes nowhere, as most of these investigations likely will go nowhere because there's no merit to them. But what's especially notable about an investigation of someone like Gavin Newsom is that there historically has been a very detailed, very laborious process that prosecutors at the Justice Department have to go through to open an investigation or prosecution of an elected public official. That process would go through Main Justice, through the Public Integrity Section, which is a specialized unit run by a career non-political prosecutor that would essentially advise the attorneys in the field in a U.S. attorney's office like the one in Sacramento, whether Main Justice standards would support opening an investigation into a political elected official. The stakes for that type of investigation are especially high because it has the potential to deprive the American people of the services of a public servant that they elected and put into that office. So the bar is very high, and it would be something that career experts in the Justice Department would weigh in on. But under this administration, the Public Integrity Section has been totally decimated, absolutely gutted. That specialized office that used to have about 36 or so employees had at last count 2 remaining staff members, just illustrating that there is no concern in this Justice Department about the norms and the values of the institution. It is all about dismantling the safeguards that allow the president and his personal fixer, Todd Blanche, to get his enemies, to punish people, even when the institutional norms don't support that. And that's what really jumped out at me about the case of Gavin Newsom here.
Speaking of toll crossings, looks like there's now going to be tolls for anybody who wants to cross the Strait of Hormuz. Now, technically, I guess it's illegal to call them tolls, but according to new reporting tonight in the New York Times, Iran apparently thinks that the outcome of this war they just won against the United States is going to include Iran having the ability for the first time to charge everyone fees to transit the Strait of Hormuz. You're not allowed to call it a toll, so they're calling it a fee, but it sort of amounts to the same thing. And this is something they didn't do before, but now they're going to start. Why are they going to start doing this? They're going to start doing this because they just won a war with the United States of America. Donald Trump started a war with Iran, and he then lost the war. The war was supposedly for regime change, right? The regime in Iran is now the same theocratic regime they had before, just with a younger, more radical mullah in charge now. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is in a position with regard to the government that is as strong, if not stronger, than it was before. Iran's nuclear program, that was another supposed reason for the war, that is still very much in place. Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium, still very much in place. Trump said he wanted regime change. He said he wanted to end their nuclear program. He wanted to seize their stockpiles of enriched uranium. He did none of these things. He said he wanted to decimate Iran's military capability. Indeed, he says he did so, but, somehow Iran maintained enough military capability to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed all this time. And as recently as this past week, they were able to shoot down an American Apache helicopter. We're apparently not allowed to see the supposed deal that Trump just signed with Iran. We'll get some expert help with that in just a moment. But bottom line, it does just seem to be Donald Trump surrendering on behalf of the American government, agreeing to cease all of our military operations there, potentially agreeing to pay Iran in the form of lifting previous sanctions or unfreezing previously frozen Iranian assets. And in exchange for us paying them, we get a return to most of the conditions that existed before the war, except things are now worse for us and better for them. That's basically the definition of losing a war. Thanks to Donald Trump starting and then losing this war, Iran is going to be richer and more influential. Its ruling regime is definitely more radical and more entrenched than ever. It can be infinitely more confident in its nuclear ambitions now that they know that the most powerful country and the most powerful military in the world couldn't do anything to end those ambitions, even at the cost of a war. I mean, really, the only difference for Iran now, materially, is that they may be able to start charging fees for ships that want to transit the Strait of Hormuz, which is something they were never able to do before. But hey, to the victor go the spoils, right? Meanwhile, American families are poorer thanks to the spike in energy prices and related inflation that Trump's war caused that may not even level out anytime soon thanks to the damage. That's not even considering the economic impact of what we spent in terms of military materiel and the American lives lost. And then there's the fact that the U.S. government has been humiliated on the world stage, reducing itself to precisely one international ally, one, Israel. Even as the president himself cannot even speak anymore about Israel's leader without using four-letter words, even in public. Remember when Donald Trump said the only way this war would end would be unconditional surrender? He maybe should have specified which country he meant by that. He also said the war would result in a great civilization being destroyed. Remember that? And again, maybe he should have been more specific as to what he meant by that. But I'm just saying, this is what he had happening at the White House, the actual White House, as he got ready to sign the supposed agreement with Iran, crying uncle and agreeing that he lost the war he himself started. Motorcycle circus at the White House. Here's the headline in the New York Times tonight on Trump's efforts to end the war in Iran. Quote, Trump winds down the war he started with goals unmet. That's a nice way to put it. Here's another from the Washington Post. Trump sought to break Iran's regime. He settled for reopening Hormuz. Here's one from Politico. Quote, Trump promised no Iranian nukes. His deal may never do that. it's kind of weird. We still don't know exactly what's in the supposed deal that Donald Trump negotiated with Iran to end the war. Based on what little we do know, it sort of looks like Donald Trump is just agreeing to give in and lose the war because he doesn't have any good military options left. And he apparently had no other ideas or plans about how to meet any of his stated goals. That also is a very nice way of saying that Donald Trump is admitting he lost the war. MS Now reports that under the agreement, quote, Iran will be allowed to have a civilian nuclear power program, a key demand from the Iranians that hardliners in the U.S. and Israel have long opposed. Both Trump officials and Iran say that under this new agreement, Iran and the U.S. will just continue to talk about the future of Iran's nuclear program, which is exactly what they were doing before Trump launched the war. Experts also tell MS Now that based on what little information we have, the nuclear deal Iran offered the U.S. before the war appears to have been better than the deal they are offering Trump now. It kind of makes sense when you consider that they won the war. Trump said the goal of this war was to destroy Iran's missile capabilities. He said their missiles would be, quote, totally obliterated. So far, the administration has not indicated that this deal in any way limits Iran's missile stockpile. The New York Times has reported that Iran still maintains about 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. And there's no reason to believe they won't now just build it back up just as strong or stronger than it was before. Trump also said this war would ensure Iran's proxy forces can, quote, no longer destabilize the region. But there's no indication that this deal will do anything to stop any of that either. The one thing the Trump administration says this deal will do is reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The only reason the strait was closed in the first place was because Trump launched this war. And today, Iran's foreign ministry is reportedly saying that the deal will allow Iran for the first time to charge fees to ships navigating the strait, fees they never charged before. As I said earlier in the show, to the victor go the spoils. Is this essentially just Trump admitting that he lost this war that he started? I mean, the White House certainly wouldn't describe it using those words, but there really appears to be nothing that the United States has, quote unquote, won in this war. If anything, if anybody won anything, it was Iran. This really does appear to just be Trump crying uncle. Joining us now is Ayman Mohaldin. He's the co-host of The Weekend Primetime on MS Now. Ayman, it's great to see you, my friend. Thanks very much for being here tonight.
Great to be with you, Rachel.
Let me just ask you let me invite you to push back on the way that I'm characterizing this. Is it fair to say at this point that we don't know of anything in this deal that puts the U.S. in a better position than we were before Trump started the war?
Absolutely not. And that's the short answer to it. There is nothing that you can demonstrably say is making America better off today than it was on February 27th. And you've gone through the entire list very accurately. And two things that I would add to that. You know, J.D. Vance was on CNBC this morning, the vice president, saying very proudly that the U.S. had destroyed Iran's military and its capabilities, somewhat to project power in the region. And he seems to have forgotten that just a few days ago, Iran shot down a U.S. Apache helicopter that we had to go rescue the two pilots that were evacuated out of that situation. On top of that, Iran hit a civilian airport in Kuwait last week, killing one person. And on top of that, Iran managed to also fire ballistic missiles at Israel, which they were able to shoot down. So if J.D. Vance, on the eve of this signing of this deal that we don't know anything about, is coming on American TV and telling the American public we destroyed Iran's capabilities, where Iran is still inflicting this kind of damage on our Arab allies, on Israel, on our own troops, then the definition of destroyed has been completely flipped upside down. And we're living in a very dystopian world where he can just come on TV and make those types of assertions and expect everyone just to go along with it.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Not to mention the fact that they certainly have sufficient military power to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, which they have and which they've shown the ability to do indefinitely. And in that issue, I do want to ask you, and I recognize this may be something on which we don't get reporting on for a while, so I'm sort of just asking for your take on this. Right. I hope that's not unfair. But why do you think this is happening right now? Why announce this agreement now? This is I think my estimation of this is Trump admitting that he has lost this war and therefore wants to get out of it. In terms of why do that now? Like, why give that to yourself as a birthday present? If I had to guess, I would say that it may be these increasingly hair on fire warnings that the oil industry has been issuing, both publicly and apparently specifically to the president, to the White House, about oil reserves dwindling, that potentially leading not just to continued high oil prices, but a huge new spike in oil prices that would come soon. I mean, I think that may be what's driving the timing, but I wanted to get your take on that, too.
No, that is a very important part of it. And one thing that, for an American audience, we know Donald Trump is if there is one thing that he does well, it is he's a master of optics, right? And he's a master of the theatrical, because he always wants to make everything look big and look theatrical in terms of how he delivers it to the American people and try to claim it as a win. But one thing that I have actually learned from my sources in the region, which I think has probably trickled its way to the president, Rachel, through our intelligence agencies, is that the American intelligence gathering capabilities in Iran have probably learned what other Arab allies and intelligence services in the regions have learned, is that Iran has consolidated its power in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. There are very sophisticated intelligence gathering operations inside of Iran, and they are probably learning that the regime in Iran is now more hardened, less likely to compromise, more willing to go to war, and that the situation is not going to get any better given the new reality inside Iran. Does that mean that the president is making his determination based on that intelligence? It's hard to know, because we don't even know if the president reads these intelligence briefings. But from what I've heard from sources in the region is that their own assessments of where Iran is today is a regime that is more consolidated with the Revolutionary Guard, alienating more of the people that might be perceived as moderates within the regime, and consolidating power more with the kind of theological military center of the regime in Iran that is more hardlined, less likely to compromise, and that has posed a challenge for the Americans and what they can actually achieve militarily.
Yeah, and another important component of what it means to lose this war, about how the American public, the American government, the American infrastructure around supporting the oil industry, around our intelligence and military interests in the region, how all of those things are worse off now because of Iran essentially outmaneuvering Trump throughout this war.
Joining me now is Democratic Senator Alex Padilla of California, a member of the Judiciary Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. Senator, as I was listening to that clip, I feel myself getting stupider, because there's not a reality where non-citizens are voting in American elections. So what you hear the Secretary talking about there is a solution in search of a problem. Why do you think that this administration continues to repeat the lie that non-citizens are somehow voting in American elections?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Alicia. And first of all, congratulations on the new show. Thanks for having me on so early. Look, we know a couple of things about the administration. For them, it's all about the spectacle. It was about the spectacle, as cruel as it was when the surges began in Los Angeles last year when it came to immigration enforcement. Of course, this last week and just yesterday, we saw a big spectacle in front of the White House. And now Markwayne Mullin is foreshadowing a spectacle at the polls this November. That's what it's about for them. Second, you said it at the top. This is a solution in search of a problem. All the studies, all the audits, all the reports show voter fraud is exceedingly rare. But there's a couple things we know about the administration. Number one, they don't like dissent. They don't like people disagreeing with them. Number two, they don't like accountability. That's why they resist congressional oversight so much, whether it's in the halls of Congress, at detention centers, or anywhere else. And third, they don't like people voting against them or against their agenda, and they're setting the stage to try to rig this November's election in so many ways before ballots are even cast.
I want to concede, Senator, that I struggle with stories like this and the decision whether or not to play the sound I just played to you from the Secretary. In a past life, I did a lot of work around voter outreach, specifically with young voters, with Latino voters, and anyone who's done that work can tell you that when you talk about voter suppression, because you want voters to be aware that that is a possibility, you always run the risk simply by sharing those threats, just like you heard the secretary doing on TV, that you will, in fact, suppress the votes. And I think about the fact that during this past election, I was reporting from my home state of New Jersey, and I talked to a lot of organizers who said, listen, just because of the ICE presence, we are now having a different experience when we go to door, right? That Latinos, U.S. citizens who used to come to the door to talk to us, they're now talking to us from second and third floor windows because they're scared, because there's just an atmosphere of fear. And so when he's talking about undocumented people, or he's talking about folks who don't have papers, he knows he's not just talking about them, right? I mean, he's talking about an entire community that has incredible electoral power, that has proven to be a swing vote in election after election. And I don't know what you're hearing from folks in California, but when I talk to folks in New Jersey, there is an element of fear that is playing into these elections.
Yeah, look, that fear, that hesitancy is real. And I totally hear, what you said. In the past, we've been maybe cautious about sharing these types of threats for fear of people feeling like maybe I shouldn't go vote because I don't want any problems. I don't want to get any issues. We're living in different times now. As several of us, not just here in the Senate, working with voting rights advocates and organizers across the country are preparing for this November's election, we have to share what's possible. We have to share what the Trump administration is threatening to do so we're not caught by surprise. And second, to let people know, to reassure them that we're aware, we're paying attention, and we're getting ready as well. So people should know that we're on the case, and we're going to do what we can to prevent their mischief, their efforts at intimidation, and remind people of their rights. If you're eligible, register to vote. Know your options for registering to vote. Make a plan for voting. You want to avoid the polls on Election Day? Great. Vote by mail if your state allows it. Most states do. Or vote early. Don't leave it to the very last day. Exercise your options. Know your rights, including the right to be able to cast your ballot without being intimidated.
Well, Senator, stay on the point that you just made about the fact that you in the U.S. Senate are doing everything you can to safeguard the vote, because just last week you had Republicans on the Senate Armed Services Committee shooting down a Democratic effort to bar federal troops from entering polling stations or seizing ballots. What have you heard from your Republican colleagues about why they can't get on board with that?
Yeah, just on these types of issues, they're just falling in line with Donald Trump because they're afraid to stand up to him. That's been the story of this Congress. When Trump came back into the White House last January, he came into an administration with a Republican majority in the House, a Republican majority in the Senate that has refused to conduct meaningful oversight to hold this administration accountable. You think we've had oversight hearings on an out-of-control ICE and CBP? Of course not. You think we've had oversight hearings on Epstein files? Of course not. You think we would exercise our time in Congress to have oversight as to why gas prices are so high, grocery prices are so high, the cost of health care is so high, the cost of housing is so high. They're saying no, 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 whatever Trump wants.
All right, Senator, I'm going to ask you to stick with us because I need to know, should a Trump impeachment be on the agenda if Democrats take back the House? The new comments from Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, reaction from Senator Padilla. That's next. We're back on what's at stake with these midterms and what could be on the agenda if Democrats manage to take back one or both chambers of Congress. Here's what we heard from House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries.
Do you agree if Democrats take back the House, will you move to impeach President Trump?
We haven't ruled anything in or ruled anything out in terms of accountability. What we have said is that our focus is going to be to make life more affordable for the American people.
Senator Alex Padilla is back with me. I know a hedge when I see one, Senator, and that was, in fact, a hedge from the Minority Leader. But if Democrats do win back the House, do you think they should make impeaching the president a priority?
Look, I in many ways agree. You don't take anything off the table, but in terms of the agenda, which should be the first order of business, I think, number one, addressing the cost of living for Americans across the country, right? Move housing legislation to bring down the cost of rents or mortgages. Move funding to restore people's access to health care and reduce the cost of health care. That's number one. Number two, it's not just affordability, it's also accountability. Oversight hearings for finding the root causes of the people who violated the rights of so many people across the country over these last 2 years, and not just the rights, the constitutional rights of immigrants, the constitutional rights of citizens. Exhibits A, B, and C. Ruben Ray Martinez, Renee Good, Alex Preddy, United States citizens who were fatally shot by federal agents for exercising their First Amendment. And third, I think I would put, how the heck did Donald Trump get us into this war with Iran? He's never justified it. We're here more than 100 days later on the verge, again, it sounds like, of a potential ceasefire. And that's all it is. It's not a peace agreement. It's a 6-month ceasefire. So by the end of the year, we'll see, number one, if it's stuck. Number two, how it's going. Because all I can tell is in Iran, life isn't better for the innocent people of Iran. It's a more extreme regime than was the case not that long ago. And the American people have been paying the price, literally, at the pump, at the grocery store, and everywhere in between.
It occurs to me, Senator, that while you talk about what is at stake for the American people, there are the things that have already transpired, the things that we know, and then there are things that have been discussed inside that White House that never saw the light of day. You got this brand new reporting from the New York Times, a secret memo from April of last year revealing that the Trump White House was debating suspending habeas corpus for undocumented immigrants as a way to speed up deportations. You well know, sir, a centuries-old right that forces the government to justify why it has someone in lockup. I want your reaction to the idea that that was even considered, especially in light of what we've heard about, the possibility that Stephen Miller is now being sidelined inside this administration. I don't believe it. I believe that potentially he is being marginalized until they get through midterms, because so much of what he has promoted is not, in fact, popular with the American people. But they take away habeas from undocumented immigrants. How long before they are stress testing that then on American citizens?
Look, exactly. I'm not shocked at all that the administration was actually considering this. We've seen their thirst for power stretch and stretch until it's reined in, which are, again, our congressional Republican colleagues aren't doing it. The courts are at times doing it. So I'm not surprised in the least bit. But it's an example of, again, when Democrats retake the majority, will have the power of the gavel, bringing people in under oath. And I think Stephen Miller is a great place to start.
Senator Alex Padilla of the great state of California. Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on our first show. Appreciate you.